Hello, hello, everyone. We are live and we'll be starting in just a moment with 5 tips on setting and communicating your boundaries. Join us in a sec. I'm unmuting you, André. Hello, good
Hello,
morning, good
Tara.
morning.
Good morning. So I had a thought. I think we should change this from live at 11 to like live-ish around 11-ish. Right?
That's
It's the
my
same,
bad this morning. I'm
but it's
sorry.
the same thing every time. Every time it's like, oh, it's like 2 minutes to 11 and we're left scrambling. It's like, I blame our producers, first of all, but it's amazing how we always come to it, like a shit show. But here we are.
Here we are. Well, I'm super happy to be with you today, André, at least virtually, since we're not in the
Mhm.
same place today.
Same here, Tara. Happy to be with you as well.
Yeah, so those of you who are new to us, we are Tara and André, and this is Mondays with Tara and André. I'm Tara Lynn Franco. I am a relationship and awesomeness coach.
You certainly are awesome. And I am André Tarkat. I'm a sex positive psychotherapist.
Awesome. And
Yeah.
we are co-founders of the online Facebook community, Let's Talk Polyamory, and
Mhm.
our awesome group program, Open Relationship and Polyamory Mastery, which is for couples who are navigating opening a relationship or transitioning to polyamory or other sort of non-monogamy or curious about it. It can be for both of those things.
Yeah, and even the straights out there, right? Even if you are monogamous, a lot of what we're looking at is applicable to not only polyamorous, open relating relationships, but to people in kind of closed relationships, if you will, but also even beyond the romantic, right? It's just about learning about consent, learning about boundaries, learning about trust, learning about communication, all those wonderful things, right? They'll increase the quality of our life in all those different relationships.
Yeah, that's a great point, Andre, because actually this training today was actually inspired by one of my clients who's not polyamorous. And we were talking about boundaries because they were wanting and curious, and they may be listening today, about how to communicate their boundaries in a sexy way, which I thought was really fun and actually added to what we've talked about previously on boundaries. So people who've watched us before talk about this is like there's an added bit in this that I'm like really super excited about.
Awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a wonderful way, right? Because I think there's different ways of going about it. Excuse me. We have our boundaries, but are we going to simply not announce them and internalize them and have people walk all over them, and then we feel hurt, we feel unseen, we feel resentful, all those things, or are we going to find a way to announce them? And what's our level of comfort in announcing them? And are we going to do it in a very direct kind of rip the bandage off? Are we going to use some humor? Are we going to do it in a flirtatious way? So we'll find out about all those different ways. Awesome.
Yeah, our
Yeah.
hot 5 tips. So if you're joining us for the first time, we do come live here every Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern. So we're
11-ish.
always live in our private Facebook group, Let's Talk Polyamory. But today we are broadcasting simultaneously to YouTube and to LinkedIn. So if you're joining us from one of those platforms, if you want to access all the content and all the resources, free resources we share or learn more about us, you can join that group and we'll make sure you can just message me or we'll drop the link as well in the chat. But we do all these talks on so many things around how we've been able to navigate our relationship and what we've learned over time, as well as what we've taught people that we work with. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah. And we get from others also, right? It's a community. So, people tell us what works for them and what doesn't work for them as well. So it's
Yeah.
really great to know. Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, so I forgot to say, if you can hear us, please drop a fire emoji in the chat. We'd love for you to actively participate today. So we will be dropping some questions, asking you some things throughout the broadcast, because boundaries, it's a personal thing, right? And people have different ways of doing it, and we'd love to learn what's worked for you, what's not worked for you, etc. So speaking of audience participation, let's start with the question. So I would love to know from people who are listening, either hashtag live or hashtag in the replay, on a scale of 0 to 5, how uncomfortable is it to share your boundaries and let the people know around you? So 0 being easy and 5 being super hard.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Tara, because it brings to mind our own level of comfort or discomfort, right? It brings to mind the awareness of it. But as you're asking that question, what is our comfort level? I wonder if it changes depending on the scenario or who we're speaking to. So if it's a casual stranger on the bus, or if it's my parents, or if it's a longtime lover or partner, does it change in any of those as well? That's interesting to know.
Yeah, we're actually going to talk a bit about that and show our boundaries layers diagram in a bit. So that's which I think it's really true. It's a great point that we may have different boundaries with different types of people, and we may be more comfortable or uncomfortable. So I would love to know. I'm just looking to see if people have been commenting in the chat.
Hey, Tara, I have a question for you, a little off this. And I'm going to out myself here. I'm out of my teens. And now I'm not quite sure how to send the emoji, the fire emoji in the thing. So, maybe you could give me a lesson on that later. Maybe it's a tutorial. But for those of us who might want to participate but don't know how, maybe we could just write fire.
Yes, you can write fire. Well, just for you, Andre, a little shortcut I learned from somebody on the Mac is you press the control and then that little like squiggly line and the space bar, and that will bring up all the emojis. And then you can pick the one you want. You can even search. But we should install the emoji keyboard on your text, because I know you've asked me to message people before, and I'm like, I want the emojis.
Yeah. Years ago, I disabled it because I thought it was a horrible way of expressing myself. Why am I going to default to these icons? And what happens if I become live in person with somebody and I want to speak to them and I don't have these icons to defer to? So I was resistant to it, but now I think I have to find that balance, and I'll invite it.
I just use them to emphasize. I don't necessarily use them to replace. So
no,
let's
it's great.
It
adds to our vernacular, so we'll go for it.
Yes. Yeah, and I get happy when I see other people's emojis added, like when there's hearts and fires and dancing people, and I don't know.
Somebody sent me one the other day of somebody doing getting their fingernails polished, and I wasn't quite sure what it meant. I had to look it up. Yeah, it didn't fit the context, but we'll see about that.
Awesome. Oh, yeah. I see people can hear us, and there's some numbers. Someone said it was a 5, but now it's a 3. Okay, so today we're going to talk about personal boundaries versus rules and agreements, why boundaries are important, and a hint, it's all about you, how to set your boundaries, how to communicate them in a sexy way, and how shifting your beliefs around your boundaries will make this a whole lot easier. And that's the part I'm super excited about, and which is sort of new to this training. So we also have a updated boundaries worksheet to go along with this this training. So stay to the end and we will give you the secret word. Or you can just send me a DM and ask for it. That's cool too. So this is just a small taste of what we have in our group program. The boundaries is part of a whole module that we have, which includes setting your personal boundaries and then using them to inform your agreements. So, so you mentioned it earlier, Andres, why boundaries are important. And I think, I think the thing about boundaries is sometimes I don't think I ever sat down and wrote down my boundaries until more recently, but knowing them and then being able to communicate them has been so important, because if we don't do these things, then like, as you said earlier, people can step on our boundaries either intentionally or unintentionally, or we may allow things to happen to us that we don't want and then have regret or resentment or reproach, or be angry at somebody about them, even if they didn't know.
Well, even if they didn't know. So that's an excellent point as well. We will announce our boundaries so people don't step on them and we feel well taken care of. But we may not know the boundaries of the other person, of our partners, and we may be stepping on them unintentionally. We may not know that, and they may find it difficult, past traumas or whatever it is. So we don't know until they tell us as well. So really, this is about trying to gain comfort in being able to receive those boundaries and to express our boundaries, so we both feel as though we're taken care of. Because at the end of the day, we want to be with people who are going to be respectful of our boundaries, and we want to be those people who are respectful of other people's boundaries, right? We don't want to inadvertently do something that might be putting the other person off. So it's
Yeah,
really good to
exactly.
be able to have these discussions about it.
Yeah, I love this comment here by somebody, which is when you don't discuss them and then they're broken, then it elevates the emotional
Sure.
factor when you have to eventually talk about them. So that's a really great point.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I haven't announced my boundaries ahead of time and they're being trampled on, I could feel resentful not only to that person, but even towards myself. Why didn't I say
Hmm.
something earlier about it, right? And then if the relationship has some other issue, all those resentments may be transferred into that. And now it becomes, instead of a 3 emotional level, it becomes like a 9, because I've had all this feeling of trauma put upon it, all these injustices done, all these boundaries that were not honored. So we're going to find a
Exactly.
way to minimize that by communicating them.
Yeah. I just realized, I think because we're both so excited about this topic, that we are speaking very quickly. And sometimes
Mhm.
the closed captioning doesn't keep up. So I'm going to try to remind myself not to get so riled up. But I am excited about this topic. So
Agreed.
let's talk about boundaries, because I think one of the things that I've seen, and you've probably seen, and probably people here in the group and who are listening have seen, is that people use the terms boundaries, rules, and agreements interchangeably, whereas they're very, very different.
Mhm.
So what
You
we're
want to tell
talking
us?
about, sorry.
Go ahead, please.
So today we're talking about boundaries, and like a general definition for a boundary is it's a line that marks the limits of an area. So when
Mhm.
we talk about personal boundaries, I think about these as the imaginary lines we draw around ourselves that maintain balance, protect our bodies, protect our minds, our emotions, our safety, our time from ourselves, from the behavior of others. So a personal boundary focuses on us. It doesn't have to do with a relationship, because people have used that term. It's like these are
Mhm.
our boundaries. So we have personal boundaries, this is my boundary, and we may have what we might call an agreement,
Mhm.
which can be informed by your boundaries. So if you have particular personal boundaries and you're in a relationship with somebody or multiple people, you may have your boundaries can inform that. So agreement being an arrangement between you and your partners.
So would you say then that when we do come into an agreement with our partners, that is only and simply an agreement, or could it be considered a boundary that we've agreed upon together? Or is that simply semantics?
Um, I like to keep it distinguished
Mhm.
between a boundary and agreement, because I think a boundary, I like to have, because you may have a personal boundary that does not enter your agreement with a particular
Mhm.
person, right? Agreement is like an arrangement that you all parties agreed to. So you may not agree with my boundary. Like, so for you, for example, like I don't like to be tickled, for example. That's one of my personal boundaries. You may be fine about tickling, but I wouldn't say we would make an agreement in our relationship around me being tickled. Like, it doesn't make sense.
Well, what if it was that I've finally found a way to invite you to receive tickling that you can tolerate, you might even enjoy, but I've only been able to discover that. So we have an agreement that we say, well, one of our boundaries, no, I guess it comes back to agreement. I was going to say that, we have an agreed boundary that only this type of tickling will be allowed. So maybe only those who are certified ticklers could do this. That's my boundary. I'm not going to let other people into that space.
Yeah. I mean, I think you talked yourself out of it there.
I think so too. Okay.
Okay, so we're not going to go into a lot about agreements today, because there's a training on this in the group, but it's also like part of our group program. We go into detail about it, but that's why we work on the boundaries first in our program, and then we get people to work on the agreements, because there is a correlation to those agreements. So
And
um,
th- and then the next level on that, I guess, after our boundaries and our agreements would be our rules.
yeah, and I would say that I prefer not to think about rules.
Mhm.
because I think rules can be very hard and fast statements of what you cannot do or must do and are more negative focused. Whereas when we talk about agreements and when we help people work through their values based agreement, we're talking about things that are more based on our agreements based on what we value rather than punitive rules. So, but I don't want to go into that because we have a lot to cover today.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah. But you mentioned it earlier, and I want to show a little diagram because I think it's relevant in terms of the first part is, so how do you actually set your boundaries? So this is number one, knowing your personal boundaries. So you can think, it's like, well, how do I come up with my boundaries? I have no idea where to start. So one place to start, like you said, is thinking about, the layers of people that are close to you. So from yourself to intimate relationships, friends and families, and then going outside all the way to strangers. So I like to think about the outstretched arm. So people that are within your arm, you probably can't see all my arms, your arm width might be people that you have different boundaries than someone, say, on a bus or train that you might be standing beside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a great diagram, right? Because it really does help to conceptualize the difference in these things. And at times there might be some things that we can allow for that will overlap and blend into each other. But at other times it'll be very distinct and we'll say, well, no, that's really crossing my personal boundary. And that's only for myself or only for intimate people or only for friends and families. And we're able to gauge that. But also I think in some ways it might also help us to justify it and saying, well, this person's a stranger. And I think the majority of people would also feel that that's not an appropriate thing. So it helps me to feel very much as though I am well supported or founded in the idea that, yes, I have this boundary and it's well recognized. And it may not be quite as simple going inward, but even at that, there are many things that we do that we feel and are recognized as personal things, and people would not come into it. But it's when these boundaries are crossed and we have to make these announcements and let people know, no, you've crossed my boundary. I'm not comfortable with this. This is my preference. And this is.
And I think this is why we're talking about this topic today, is it's good to get in front of those things so you don't get to that point where they've crossed it, right? So, how do you figure it out? So you can think about it in terms of the layers that we just showed. And that diagram is actually on the awesome worksheet we have today. So stay to the end and we'll share that secret word or send me a DM. So you can start by asking yourself some questions. So, are there areas of my life or different interactions with people, family, friends, outsiders that leave me feeling, say, uncomfortable or hurt or anxious, maybe tired, unsafe? Some of these things. And this can inform or push your buttons. These can inform the types of boundaries that you might write down. And in terms of writing them down themselves, you can start by saying no. You can make no statements. So for my example of tickling, I could say no tickling, but you may want to word it in a way of things that you value. I can't think of an example off the top of that, but I think about my personal boundary, and I think you have a similar one around sexual health. So you can say it as an I am or value statement. So I value my sexual health and get tested regularly. I ask my partners to do the same and ask them to keep me informed of their sexual history.
Right. So you framed it in a positive, right? I value. These are the things I do. This is important to me. And then you're able to share that in a very matter-of-fact, casual kind of way. But it also tells us the importance of it because you're saying that it's a value to you. So if I value you, if you value me, then this should be important to me as well.
Yeah. And this is a good example, like your crossover example, where this particular value can form your agreement. So we have an agreement around sexual health because that is a value we both share. So that, for example, that very thing is part of our agreement.
Well, to that point, talking about the values, the agreements, and the boundaries, I think some people might even go so far as to say it's a rule, right? So they'll say, well, until we are fluid bonded, we're not going to have unprotected sex with other people. And that might be a rule that they've come to agree upon because it informs them of their boundaries.
I still prefer not to call it a rule.
No, you do. I
I
know you
really
do.
don't like that term because, for
Oh,
some
but hang on a
people,
second. To say that it's punitive, I can understand the idea, the relationship between rule and punitive, but it might also be a rule that is there to protect us, right? So we're not
mhm,
punishing anybody by this, but we're saying that in order for us to feel safe, we've agreed upon this rule, and we're not going to have unbarriered sex unless the following. So this rule makes us feel safe when the other person goes out with somebody, or when we're there together with somebody new. We feel as though it's a safety thing. It's not necessarily meant to be punitive, but it is there for maintaining our boundary.
I think it's still, if it's between two people, it's still an agreement. And that's what we encourage people to do, is create values-based agreement. But
Yeah.
I can see how you might have a rule related to your boundary for yourself. You know what
Hmm.
I mean? But that would inform your agreement. I just think that rules tend to be broken. And often, when rules are made in relationships, particularly newly opened or polyamorous relationships, they tend to be put in place to protect something
Hmm.
and don't actually work in that way. I mean, I can see sexual health being one of those things that might, skim the surface of, it's okay to have a rule, but for other things that you would think would make you insecure, that sort of thing, I still think that it's better to base your agreements on your values. So let's continue with boundaries, since that's today's topic. So number 2 is write down why they're important to you.
Hmm.
So this is not to say that you need to explain your boundaries, personal boundaries, to anyone or justify them. The
Hmm.
reason it's important to know your why is so that it makes it easier for you to share it. So that's, I think, where the values also come in. So if I know why it's important to me, it's much easier to share it. And I think it's also, what's good about this as well is, when you start to write down your boundaries and your whys around it, if you see that there's sort of a mismatch between your boundary and the reason, and so the boundary is actually not getting at the why, then that's an opportunity then to look at that to see if it's something that you want to work through.
Hmm. That's a good point.
Yeah. So, I mean, why have them in general? Like, we want to have boundaries because they basically say they're like the self-care we give each other, ourselves, right? I
Mhm.
matter, my feelings matter, my health matters. So that's why we're suggesting for each one you write down your why. So that was number 2.
I like your other 2 points also. My dreams matter and my needs matter.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, very important.
Yeah. So on the worksheet you can get today, that there's a section to write down these things, your whys.
Hmm.
So number 3, and this is my favorite, and this is new, like newly added, but inspired by my client, is working on your beliefs around your boundaries.
Hmm.
So this is the big part about being able to communicate them. So I think that sometimes it's hard to communicate our boundaries, or we may feel uncomfortable because we may feel like we're being too difficult or too picky, or that my boundaries make me difficult to date. And, we've heard this from a friend recently. And, I've also heard this from my client that inspired this part of the talk, is saying that, my boundaries are too hard for someone. Like, they're not going to want to date me if I have these boundaries.
Right.
So I think the idea is, like, what other empowering beliefs would you like to choose instead? So I told that same client, I think they're listening, they're going to be listening today, is that, I was saying to them, and I said quite bluntly, is like, I don't think that you're any different than anybody else in terms of
Mhm.
your boundaries. Like, I actually shared some of the same boundaries, even with different whys behind it. And so it's, for example, wanting to take things slow. One of my boundaries is I don't send nudes by text to someone that I've never met before. That's a hard boundary for me. Not hard, it's a firm boundary for me, is I don't want to share nudes. And in fact, it's not really something I do anyway, even when I know the person. But particularly if I haven't been intimate or I haven't met them in person, that's a thing that I don't do. And I do tell people, and if they're not good with that, then they've just been filtered out.
But Tara, you raise an interesting point, and going back to the idea of what it's like for us to announce our boundaries, right? And the consideration that, well, it might be difficult for us for a number of reasons. Maybe we've had boundary issues in the past. We may have some, unfortunately, some trauma that we might have to have endured. It may be continuing, but there's also this idea, I think that you're alluding to, the idea that, well, I don't want to seem like I'm such a downer, that like, well, you can't do this and you can't do that and you can't do this other thing. And then we start imagining, well, they're not going to want to be with me if I'm such a downer, right? I've got all these restrictions, I've got all these boundaries, when in fact, the other person may be very open to receiving all these things. And then because they know, well, if you feel safe, if you feel acknowledged, if your boundaries are identified and understood, then we can be comfortable with that. So I know not to do this thing or to refrain from that other thing because it might not be to your liking. And if I'm there because I want to please you and be pleased, I'm not going to want to be doing things that are going to be upsetting to you or cause for any type of distress. So I'm going to want to honor these boundaries. I'm going to want to know of them because I want you to feel invited. I want you to feel loved. I want you to feel seen and respected, the same as you would want from me. So I invite that dialogue. So if you are ever having difficulty in expressing that, know that the other person is open with their heart and receptive to it. They're wanting to know these. And as you said, if they're not, then they may not be your people.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just adding that to the notes. I actually like that. That's one that I missed, is that they probably have boundaries too. And by you sharing yours, that will open up the door for them to share theirs.
Absolutely.
And like, that was the thing I was saying to my client. And I love that. I just want to emphasize it again, that anyone who I'd want to be with wants to know my boundaries so that they can do the things that excite me and give me pleasure rather than things that don't. So that's a belief that I have. And so it may take some practice to take on that belief, but that's a good one. I also, like, a friend of ours said to me at one point, I was sort of, at that point, I was not wanting to engage any further. And I was sort of apologetic, and they were like, I'm just here for your pleasure. And I just love that. And so imagine if you believe that your partners are there for your pleasure, how would it make you feel about communicating your boundaries?
Also it makes me think of consent, right? So you put out your boundaries and they say, I acknowledge those boundaries and I consent to that. I can be within those parameters. That's not a problem for me. I want to be there. And then they could announce yours and you could say, yes, I see and recognize your boundaries and I consent to those as well. And now we're both going into it feeling as though we've announced our position. We feel safe and secure in that. And then we can make that into our playground. It's a wonderful thing to have these boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. There's another one I like, which is my partner gets turned on by me being turned on. So again, they would want to know what turns me on, what excites me rather than what doesn't. So that's
sure. And not only what turns you on, but I want to know what turns you off. So if I'm trying to create a mood and, I think, well, you might be fun to tickle you and it's actually having the adverse effect, well, then it's heading in the wrong direction, the opposite direction for both of us. So I wouldn't want that. Right. So it's good to have these, knowing that it will lead to more potentially more pleasure, but also that it won't be sending us in the opposite direction where we feel, uptight and defended against.
Yeah. And one of the things we share with our clients is a yes, no, maybe list, which can be a fun way of and there's of working through what things you do want and don't want, and then sharing that with your partner. So using it as a tool. So that's something in the toolkit that we give people in our program. So I'd love to know in the comments, what are some beliefs that you want to adopt to make it easier to communicate your boundaries? Did any of this inspire anything? Is there anything you want to add? I'd love to include more beliefs around this. Somebody's asking, I'm going to just pause for a second to answer this question. Andre, they're saying, do you feel that agreements are something that can be revisited with time in different situations where boundaries are more set because of possible emotional triggers? That is a great question.
Yeah. And I'd say right away, if I'm understanding the question correctly, do you feel that there's something that can be revisited? And I would say, absolutely. We are plastic, right? We change over time. We change from moment to moment. We change depending on who we're with and scenario to scenario. So I think that we can always restate and revisit our boundaries. We can always be open to explore them. We can always be able to identify them in the moment. So what I might have said yesterday may or may not be continuously true, but again, a lot like consent, it is in the moment. So we're always free to announce our boundaries. And if they've changed, then we announce those.
Yeah, exactly. I think boundaries are probably change less frequently than agreements, but I think that's, I don't know, maybe not. But I like what you said, that we could, we have the opportunity anytime to revisit our boundaries. Are there things that we don't feel comfortable with now that might be more comfortable later? And depending on the person and the situation. And some people just may be different, and those things don't feel like a boundary with certain people, like when they're closer, for example. So that was a great question.
Yeah, it sure is. And it's, I think, a good segue into number 4, right? How we communicate our boundaries. So we communicate our boundaries as clearly and simply as possible. We try to be specific, and we might even give examples if possible.
Yeah, exactly. So, one of the things you can use is similar to the nonviolent communication method of circumstance, feeling, thought, need, and request. Some of the ways you can share them in a sexy way or non-sexy way is, when this happens, when X happens, I feel Y. I'd love it if you did Z, for example. You can also frame it the sexy way that I shared with my client was, one of the things that excites me is blank. What excites you? And open up the conversation. We talked about taking it slow. I value taking things slow to build anticipation and excitement over time. So I like to start with X, and then once I feel Y, then we can do Z. What about you? These are kind of the sort of, and you can play with these. So would love to hear from people in the comments, some of the things that you do, or if any of these things you like them. I sort of like, I had to really think when she asked me how to say them in a sexy way. Because people don't necessarily need to know why we have a certain boundary if we don't know them. I tell people all the time, I don't have a problem with saying to someone, the reason I don't like being tickled is because when I was a kid, I was held down and tickled until I cried. And so I find it anywhere gets anywhere near my underarms, I get very,
Yeah, that's horrible, right? So that trauma is carried forward, right? So with traumas, we know that the 2 hemispheres of the brain will experience the trauma differently, or receive it, process it differently, right? So the intellectual part of our brain says, yes, I know the trauma is over, it's done, that's in the past, but the emotional part may still be reliving it. So when we do come in to something like tickling, all of a sudden it is reactivated, and we're right back to that moment that it happened. So the intensity of that, unless it's been processed, will still be with us, carried forward. So that's why we really have to be mindful of the traumas that we've had before, and what we can do to process them, but also how we can communicate that as a boundary so that we continue to feel safe.
Yeah, so something I might say is, I really like to be touched gently on the arms or on the back, but I don't like to be touched gently in my underarms. So please, please stay away.
And while you may enjoy that in itself might be triggering for somebody else, right? So if they've had some issue with boundaries being crossed, where somebody was inappropriate with them and touched them gently, that might be a very triggering thing for them. So again, it's imperative. It is beyond that. It is, I don't know how to express the level of importance that they be able to communicate that this is not of their liking, that we have to advocate for ourselves.
Yeah. Exactly. So being clear, simple as possible, and being specific was number 4. And number 5, being prepared to remind people. Sure. Yeah. So, we don't want to remind people of our boundaries, but the truth is sometimes people forget, like they don't know, or they don't necessarily know what we like and we don't like, especially if the time has passed and that sort of thing. So, you may have to remind, but if people do not continue to not respect your boundaries, then that's where you have to take action in some way.
Right.
So
yeah, I like to start off with the gentle part first. It's like almost like an invitation, right? And we alert them to it. We inform them in a rather casual way, perhaps, and we feel pretty easy about it. And then unfortunately, if they're not picking up on that, we might reintroduce it with a little level of some humor maybe brought into it, whatever's, again, making us feel comfortable. But if it's not noticed, if it's not acknowledged, then we step it up and we have a firmer announcement and we let them know. And if they still are not able to do that, then we might have to bring it beyond that, where we say, well, I'm sorry, you've crossed my boundaries, you're not respecting them, and I think we need to go elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can emotionally detach, physically distance yourself, or end the relationship.
Right.
But I would take the chance to communicate and talk to the person first about what's been going on and how you feel about it. I like this comment. Sometimes I find people actually have respect when I do share boundaries, which is, I feel, is true. But this is interesting as well, like what about the emotional toll that happens when boundaries are continuously broken, and how to deal with next steps. So how they find this the most difficult. So I think this is where, you have to be really specific about your boundaries, and using the nonviolent communication method, or our attunement communication, which is what we teach in our program, having a conversation about what it's like for you, and focusing on myself when the boundaries are crossed, and why, and at that point, if it's someone you're in a longer term relationship with, you might want to talk about why they're important to you. And that may support them remembering them,
But I love what you say about attunement communication, right? Because I could announce my boundaries, but is the other person really listening? And are they listening to understand? Are they really getting what I'm saying? Or are they simply like, yeah, and then they're on to the next thing and never really hearing what it is I'm putting down?
Yeah.
So it's important that we be active listeners in that, right? That we participate to hear what the other person is saying, so we can absorb it and then be able to act accordingly. We can respect that boundary.
Yeah, and like our attunement communication model, it's taking the timing is super important. Timing, tone, and turf, right? So maybe not choosing the moment where you're emotionally triggered to have that conversation, really thinking about it, and then planning a time to talk about it when you're feeling more neutral and relaxed, and can have a conversation, and keep in mind all those, making your I am statements and all that stuff, even though this person has crossed your boundary, having the conversation with that open mind. Sorry.
Yeah, I totally agree, right? So ideally, we're not going to be doing it while it's a heated moment and all that. But at the same time, that being said, your personal care, your security, your boundaries, prioritize. So while it might not be ideal, if you're ever feeling at risk or feeling as though it's not a go situation, you must announce that and say, I need to stop. This is not happening for me. This is my boundary and it's being crossed. So either we will modify it or change it or get out of it. We'll find some other options available to us. But yes, we must prioritize ourselves in the way of self-preservation first.
Yeah, exactly. Because we know of situations where that's happened. Someone's boundary has been crossed. They didn't say it to the person. They felt very emotionally triggered, and then was not open to having a conversation later, and had devastating results for the person who crossed the boundary, not knowing that they did that.
Right. Yeah, it's not a win-win for either of the people there, right? And then it can be in itself create another trauma. So yeah, we really want to be mindful of that, right? And know that we are justified, know that we don't need justification to announce our boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. So just to review, so that's the 5. So today we shared the 5 tips for setting and communicating your boundaries. So number 1 was knowing your boundaries first, writing down why they're important, working around your beliefs around your boundaries, communicating them clearly, simply, and specifically. And then number 5, being prepared to remind and take action if necessary. So simple, right?
Theoretically, it's putting it into practice, but it gets
feels
easier.
hard.
I'm sorry. I think it's theoretically it's easy, but then putting it into practice is another thing. But the more you practice it, the easier it gets. It's like a great many things, that the more you start to create those neural pathways, they become lubricated and more accessible.
Yeah, for sure. So we mentioned a few times in this broadcast that setting your boundaries is a part of one of the modules of our group program, Open Relationship and Polyamory Mastery. We actually walk you through this specifically in a training in more depth than what we did today. And we have like an entire exercise on this that you do on your own and then with your partner. And then that's what's used to inform the next module, which is on setting your agreements. So if this is something that you would love to learn for yourself, and you're interested in knowing about our 16-week awesome program, then you can drop mastery in the comments and I'll reach out and we can have a chat to see if it's a fit for you. Because it may not be a fit for you, but we feel it's a really great program and the people have been through it, have had amazing results, and we'd love for that to happen for everyone. So, we promised your bonus for listening today is to get our worksheet, our new and improved boundaries worksheet, which is a small version of what we have in our program that'll get you started. So the word is, what do you think the word is, Andre?
Boundaries? Fire?
Yes.
Boundaries?
Yeah.
Oh, I got it. All right.
So you can drop that in the comments or send us a message and we'll make sure you get that worksheet. We can also chat about what's going on in your personal circumstances as well and see, because this stuff's, it seems easy and there's so many, resources out there to get you started on it, but actually it is hard to do in practice and it does take time. So we like to make it easier for you to do that. So that's what we're here for. So, hopefully people got that we didn't talk too fast. And that's another Monday and it's a wrap. Thanks, Andre.
Yeah. Thank you, Tara. Thank you everyone for tuning in.
I can't wait to see you again soon, boo.
Yeah, indeed. Looking forward to it.
Bye, everyone. It was boundaries. Someone's asking what was the word. You can just send me a message too.
I'll put it in.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic Monday. Let us know what you thought. And we'll chat again soon.
Bye.
Bye.